Hello, my name's Mark Ridler. I'm the lighting director of BDP. We're a multidisciplinary building design partnership, and I run the lighting design part of that. And the subject I'm going to talk to you about today is the circular economy and how it relates to lighting. Just a little bit of background on this. This is what I'm going to show you today is a work in progress research project that we've been running for a year. And it started really at the back end of 2019 when I was approached by a number of suppliers who raised this topic with me. And whilst it'd been on my radar for a number of years, I'd never really found much appetite within the wider community for it. And this was really exciting that actually the supply chain were taking a lead and doing some real very good thought leadership. So I thought, okay, 2020, this is going to be the year that we do CE in BDP and actually work out what we want to do. So listen and research for the first 6 months, consult for the third quarter, and then at the end of the year come up with a tangible difference as to how we actually design and specify our work. So I'm just going to jump in now. We were lucky to be blessed with a project in March, where the circular economy was actually right at the centre of the brief, and this is the result partly of that, and also the conversations that we've been having with our partners in the lighting, but clients, other designers, contractors, supply chain, and operators. So you may be familiar with various models of circular economy and how it contrasts with linear economy. But this is our take on how it actually applies through the narrow lens of lighting. And it starts with the briefing for a new project. It addresses the design, goes through construction in use to the end of life, and then how that relates back into the briefing process. And when we started looking at this, it became quickly apparent that we couldn't just do this on our own, that we needed our clients, our other design partners, particularly in electrical engineering and architecture, interior design, and contractors and operators, in order to make this circle complete. If you've got any one of those out of the loop, this circle breaks and the whole system falls down. So, and what we were trying to do is using the well-known hierarchy of waste. So where avoid is what we should really be trying to do right at the beginning of any process, and then going through reduce and reuse, and then trying, where we failed to do that, go into recycling, and then really trying to avoid recover, treat, and dispose. And the presentation that is structured, all of the subsequent slides are structured in this way, just so you understand where to be looking on the slide as we come to it. So this symbol tells us where we are in the circle of life. This is the topic that we'll be talking about. And then there are touch points as to how this subject relates to one of the other stakeholder groups. So starting with avoid, and I'm going to start in the design circle because I'm a designer, it's where I have greatest impact. Daylight is the substance, it's the free light that we should all be using. It's completely carbon neutral. It has all sorts of benefits that we know very well, and I could do several lectures just on the subject of daylight. But how our clients have got all sorts of benefits by using daylight, energy, sterilization, but there needs to be a recognition that it's the architectural brief that will really drive daylight performance. And interestingly, on this project, we were refurbing a 1970s tower office development where the daylight was actually really, really excellent. single-sided, but you were getting penetration pretty much all the way into certainly the task, if not the circulation area. What we were doing here in terms of the design was a daylight scene, which was concentrating on indirectly illuminating the soffit, and then in the evening, a more selective task-based solution. But it meant that actually the daylight performance was so good that we could actually choose not to install 1/3 of the daylight solution. There was a massive saving in terms of capital, but also the amount of material that we were bringing into the project, and therefore we were doing a lot of avoiding. And the new daylight metrics that we're increasingly using, actually moving away from the old daylight factor metrics into metrics in terms of daylight availability and usable daylight, are expressed in more familiar metrics, which allows us to combine artificial lighting design with daylight lighting design, so that we can actually proceed with much more confidence and optimize our designs, particularly when we're looking to reduce the amount of lighting that we're going to install. Another one, it's a phrase that I use, which is code intelligence, which is using the Euro norms and in the UK, the British standards, but using them intelligently and not just blanket illuminating, particularly workplace offices with 400, 500 lux everywhere, but actually deciding where do you need that light and putting it there. And where can you let that light fall away? That typically within an office environment, only 30% of the floor plate will actually be task. The rest of it will be a dark absorber carpet. If you're actually providing task level of illuminations everywhere, you're wasting 70% of 70% of the light, and that's just an obscene waste of energy. But it also means that you're putting more physical material into the space. If we pursue a more task-orientated design philosophy, then it's a really powerful reductive strategy. The other thing is that the clients need to understand what the impact on their space is going to be in terms of flexibility. It's not that they can't do it flexibly, but they need to buy into this as a system. And control, the third part of the right amount of light in the right place at the right time. And the control is about the right time. And it's much more difficult than it should be, but we work with the supply chain to try and make it as easy as possible. And encouragingly, the new wireless systems seem to be much more intuitive and adaptable, and easier to commission, easier to adapt day two in use, and also offer the promise of greater user interaction and flexibility as well. They also have the opportunity to provide data, which is a really big plus for our clients, because that allows optimization of a project, but also if it's part of a wider estate. And it also provides data for the staff to understand what the building is doing, and it's a real way of engaging your staff in the story. And we've been working with suppliers as well on the trying to reduce the amount of material within fittings that is not recyclable. And there's a lot of people, this is not an exhaustive list. And in fact, in the last day, I came across another really interesting company called Skinflint, who do actually recycle heritage fittings from the 1920s, 1970s, and then we'll take that back and then provide it back into the system. But these ones came out of the project we were working on, and they're using things like making fittings from cardboard, recycled plastics, wood, and such like. So really interesting work there, and we're interested in working manufacturers who are on this journey and are looking at reducing the amount of stuff or the recyclability of their materials. And packaging is part of the story, which we're engaging with more than we have done in the past. And there's all sorts of things here. For avoiding plastic and using cardboard is a really good step. But there's this company called Luna who also interestingly put multi-fittings within single packets and got rid of a lot of packaging, but also did some knock-on benefits work to the contractor, where it was reducing theft on site, but also it was allowing product to be packaged for a particular area, so they could package up a floor or a room rather than relying on the contractor to do that on site. The other thing we're noticing is certainly in the UK, local manufacturing, and we're trying to source now manufacturers close to project, but also looking at their supply chains, and we're finding that quite a lot of people are beginning to repatriate manufacture from China back into the country of assembly. And one of the reasons they're doing this is because it shortens the supply chain, increases communication. And that's leading to marginal gains in the design, which is generating reduced material, but also better performance, lower in manufacture costs, and that's actually negating some of the perceived increase in manufacturing costs by doing it within Europe. So it's a really interesting story there. And other companies like Whitecroft who are saying that engaging in this story is a real differentiator from cheaper Me Too products elsewhere in the globe. So there are some really big brands as well that are getting on this journey and seeing material business benefit from doing so. But if we're going to, at the moment, there is no circular economy tick box. It's not like BREEAM or one of those systems. It's very complicated, and there's a lot of people that are forging their own road, which is great, but it means that you can't just tick a box and then do an equal and approved value engineering process subsequent to specification. And this is really important. And it's important because the clients need to understand that if they want us to do a CE project, they want us to engage in this fashion. And we do all of this research and we select manufacturers that are doing great work. They can't then throw all of that work in the bin in a value engineering process downstream. If we're going to ask our clients to do this, they need cost certainty much earlier in the design process. So it means that actually now as designers, we're doing a lot more detailed costing, schematic design and detailed design, so that the clients can commit to a specification with confidence. But then that also has an impact on the contract that a client will have with a contractor. So if they don't want them to do equal and approved, they want them to stick to spec, then they need to write contracts in that fashion. And they also need to set up the project governance to make sure that what they want happens. And then the other, in terms of reuse, we're finding that floor mounted and table mounted tasks is a really great way of providing light to a space, but it also has the benefit at the end of the project, you can pick it up and take it to another project without actually having to go into the ceiling or expensive disassembly or unwiring and all the safety and aspects that come with that. It's a technique that's used more in Europe than is in the UK, but it's becoming prevalent, more and more prevalent. And it was interesting that I was showing a large corporate client this slide the other day, and they really loved the aesthetic, and that was quite unusual. Normally clients are quite resistant to floor-based tasks, but it seems as though the mood music may be changing. Another way of reusing is increasingly projects are bringing prefabricated rooms into the buildings, and of course if the light goes with that, then the light comes into the building with the prefab. But it also means that you can then reuse that room, take it to another project, and of course the light travels with it, so the light naturally is becoming reused. But if they're going to do this, this has to be very much part of the client brief. The operators and the FM need to feed into the specification in terms of maintainability and flexibility. And again, the contractor needs to stick to spec. Another system that we use in terms of reuse is demountable. It's a posh word for track and spot, but there are other ways of doing this. And it means that, and again, particularly with wireless control, it allows you to simply and toollessly unplug a luminaire and then box it, take it to a new project, and then plug it back in. And if we've got standardization of this kind of electrical infrastructure, then it means that it's very adaptable between buildings. And that's what the wireless control is, something that is really, really good, because it's luminaire specification specific rather than building specific. And so the control travels with the luminaire. And also it means that the infrastructure, the lighting infrastructure, the wiring, and the structural and mechanical support is demountable as well and can travel. And that's one of the sustainable circular economy principles, is that they're trying to layer buildings so that they are not as intrinsically enmeshed, because that enmeshing actually drives value out of the systems that you're installing later downstream. And it's quite a big change for us, because for years I've been integrating light into architecture. And we're now beginning to move away from that, but it's having an aesthetic impact for sure, but not a bad one. I'm actually quite enjoying this dialogue with architects and interior designers, and it's driving real innovation. I think it's something that we'll see more and more of. This slide's about recycling and reuse. And speaks to that kind of removable infrastructure, but it's also kind of got an interesting story in terms of the way we're specifying it, but also a kind of design philosophy. So you'll remember the slide earlier on where we had the daylight shot with an indirect scheme for daylight illumination. We commissioned a very simple H extrusion with a standard track to be mounted within, and then a uplight with a very batwing asymmetric uplight distribution, which gave much better uniformity on the ceiling. And we ran a mini tender for 3 manufacturers to supply this. And what was really interesting, that the winning tenderer could provide the H section and the track for 1/3 of what they would normally buy a track for. And it was because of volume of manufacturer and the gains that were gained from that. So by doing actually a kind of CE approach, actually was driving costs out in terms of per unit supply as well. And then this track system then allows you to plug in a whole variety of toolkit of luminaires depending on what you're doing, where you are. So this could sail over open plan, breakout, even in meeting rooms, circulation, all those kind of variety of different spaces that you would expect to find in a workplace. We had an infrastructure there that allowed us to flex the design, both in terms of day 1, but also in day 2, 3, and so forth. And at the end of life, you could undo all of this toolkit, box it, ship it to your new project, and then take down the infrastructure and ship that with you as well. And there was some other interesting innovations, like we chose not to paint the H because it was reducing the chemicals involved in paint. But then we asked the client and the designers whether they liked that raw aluminium aesthetic, and indeed they did. So this is an example of how innovation is driving benefit in terms of CE, but also driving aesthetic in new ways, but good ways. And then in terms of reuse, we're beginning to actually demand from our supply chain that that their luminaires are serviceable and deconstructible at end of life, and to encourage them in terms of take back schemes. LEDs broke the luminaire lamp paradigm and went towards much more bonded systems, which are actually really quite difficult to break down at end of life. But the new Euro eco design regulations are coming into force. In fact, they are in force, and that's beginning to be enshrined in local national law as well. But notwithstanding Brexit, it's still going to be going into the new environmental bill in the UK, and it requires you to be able to change lamps. So it's moving back towards the lamp luminaire paradigm again. And whilst for spotlights and for downlights, I think that's entirely achievable. Well, it is achievable now. In terms of linear, that's going to be a bit more difficult to achieve, but we need to start thinking about it because it's going to become a requirement quite soon. And it also leads towards additive manufacture rather than subtractive manufacture. And has various other implications knock on down. And Mike Stone, for instance, is doing a really interesting piece of work on how they can use a kit of parts, which then adapts into various manifestations of the same product. And they're also providing other innovations like a repair and adapt on-site service, so that you can update your installation with latest tech and perhaps different features 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years down the line without you having to rip it all out, skip it, buying you some new kit. Yes, this is from a car, but in terms of reuse, it's a very important thing. We need to know how long the fittings have been used, as well as whether they've been overvolted or they've had heat problems. But if you can capture data on the luminaire in use, then that provides value at the end. And Staccato already do this in their models on chip, but it shouldn't. We need to start building this into a facility for all luminaires, I think, and that's going to be generating. It's going to be creating value downstream. And then the supply chain, we've now come out of design into construction. This is the general point, and this is really where we start discovering the crucial part of the other players in the team, is that if we've done all this good work with our clients and created a design that is intrinsically or potentially circular economy, we need the contractors to buy into this and to do what we've asked. So packaging is a classic one. If we specified that packaging is to be recycled, then it needs to be done, because otherwise the whole thing falls down. And that means that clients got to really think about contract models and how they institute project governance to make sure those contracts are enforced. It also means the operators who are going to be receiving this soon, they need to monitor warranty. So if they're returned to manufacturer agreements in place, they need to take ownership of those and to make sure that indeed those things are honoured downstream. And they need to really early engagement with the supply chain to understand what those kind of new arrangements are going to be. And they need to confirm ongoing support and return for factory commitments. So they need to buy into this story as well. And that's very much about the client CapEx team establishing ongoing relationships with the client OpEx team. And sometimes there's quite big barriers between those two teams. And then the contractor needs to commit to the whole guys. They need to understand what they're being asked to do, commit to it, and then report back to make sure that it all happens. And then in operation, the really essential part of the operator's responsibility is, unless you know what stuff is in your building, there is no chance of reusing or recycling it, because you don't know what you're going to reuse or recycle. So having an accurate inventory is absolutely essential to this story. Lighting's in quite a good place to help with that, because the way in which it can broadcast data and essentially to help optimize, to identify itself within a building and where it's been and how long it's been used, actually helps in this story. There are other systems that are more difficult, but we're beginning to talk about material passports and such like, and even simple printed QR codes can do an awful lot without going into necessarily the sophistication of, for instance, blockchain, or those kind of technologies, although they are definitely coming down the road, and I think the industry needs to be prepared about that. But one of the benefits for operators, if they buy into this, is that they then start getting a lot more information about their building, and it allows them to optimize their building and also optimize within the wider estate. And as I've said before, also engage with staff. Clients are finding this is increasingly important in terms of recruiting staff and retaining them. And then end of life. Well, is it end of life? The second-hand car market, again, a slightly humorous slide, but essentially, if you have all of this information, you know its basic functionality of a luminaire, you know its service history, how much life it then has left, it gives it a value. But without that information, it has no value. And it only has the value that the scrap merchant can extract from it by destroying and recycling it, and that is pretty low. But if you actually maintain this, then it really has a reuse value. And there will start being building, there'll be businesses springing up that will be extracting money and business opportunities from that value. And I think it's absolutely the way we should be thinking of going, is that if we can provide this information, then there will be business opportunities and employment opportunities downstream. So, and then the return to brief. We've gone through this circle, we've come to end of life. We should be learning whole loads of lessons from every part of that story, and then writing that into new briefs that our clients then bring to the design team. But one of the ways in which I'm kind of testing our clients at the moment is that by asking them, for your project that you've employed us to do, would you consider using reconditioned or second-hand luminaires? Would you consider where in your estate you've got equipment already that you could reuse for this project? The answer is no. Then they're not engaged. Then there's no point even starting this project as a CE project. But interestingly, I'm really not, that's not what I'm hearing from clients. Clients are really getting this and are really enthusiastic. There's companies like Lush, who Michael Grubb Studios has worked for years, have been on this story for 4 years. And we've been talking to large institutional landowners, and they are all very, very receptive to this story. The beginning of the journey, they want to do it, they want to engage, particularly with us as lighting designers, to actually see how they may make this a reality. And I've got a meeting next week with an international bank to talk about just doing this, to doing a seed project, work out how they could do it, but with the view of actually influencing the way in which they specify their global estate. So it's a big story at the moment. We're also finding that the professional organisations like the Society of Light and Lighting, part of CIBSE, which is the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers in the UK, they're starting an initiative. We've seen it from the International Association of Lighting Designers, the ILD. Today, of course, we're talking to you. So the debate is really live, and that's very encouraging. So the key takeaways are circular economy is necessarily collaborative. Designers alone and the supply chain alone will have very limited impact. It's going to have a very profound impact on equal and approved, and therefore value engineering and contract models. It needs governance all the way through the life cycle, and that's a big challenge. And it requires innovation in the supply chain because standards are not yet available, although the professional organizations I mentioned earlier are really working very hard at actually providing some. And interestingly as well, they're not trying to create the perfect standard. They're trying to provide fast standards which can be iterated and improved year on year, which I think is a much more flexible and exciting way forward. So it's not like we're going to solve this problem immediately, but I think we can get very much better very quickly. And then this meshes into a wider, this is the BDP circular economy principles, but and I won't talk through this slide in detail, but it meshes into the wider process of building buildings. It's just that lighting is seen as being one of the bits of those buildings that is moving really fast in this topic, and it's maybe a relatively easy win, but also a trailblazer, and the way in which we can learn our lessons will allow us to feed back into the wider design community and start generating these principles more widely within the built form. So that's the end of what I have to say today. I hope you found it interesting. If you want to learn more, then either contact Luga or directly myself at BDP, and let's start the conversation. Thank you very much.